The prince never left. Power, access, and the eternal currency of influence. A Machiavellian analysis of political and corporate power. The eternal logic of the prince. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in the early 16th century, made an observation that has never become obsolete. Power is not merely held. It is performed, traded, and above all, protected. In The Prince, he argued that the effective ruler must be willing to act outside conventional morality when circumstances demand it, because the world does not reward virtue, it rewards control. Half a millennium later, his analysis remains uncomfortably precise. The names change. The mechanisms do not. The relationship between Prince Andrew, Duke of York, and the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein offers a vivid case study, not merely as a scandal, but as a window into a far older and more universal system. What appears on the surface to be a personal moral failing is, when examined through a Machiavellian lens, the visible tip of a vast and submerged structure, the architecture of access, where titles, influence, and favors are traded as freely as any commodity on a market floor. To be surprised by Andrew's behavior is to misunderstand the system entirely. He was not aberrant. He was operating exactly as the system was designed. 2. The monarchy, legitimacy dressed in mythology. Machiavelli distinguished between two types of principalities, those acquired by virtue and those acquired by fortune. Hereditary monarchies belong entirely to the latter category. The accident of birth confers power, and the institution survives not through merit, but through the sustained belief of the governed in its legitimacy. It is, as Machiavelli might have observed, the oldest and most resilient of political illusions. That monarchies persist into 2026 is not, therefore, evidence of their virtue. It is evidence of their extraordinary skill at self-perpetuation. The British royal family has refined this art over centuries, transforming the raw fact of inherited privilege into a cultural mythology of duty, continuity, and national identity. Yet beneath the pageantry lies a remarkably transactional reality. Titles carry access. Access carries influence. Influence carries value. Prince Andrew understood this intuitively, even if he exercised his understanding with catastrophic lack of judgment. He is hardly the first royal to monetize proximity to power. Throughout European history, courts functioned as influence markets, where nobles, merchants, and foreign dignitaries competed for the ear of the monarch. What changed in the modern era was the formal prohibition of such transactions, while the informal architecture enabling them remained entirely intact. 3. Religion as the instrument of the state. Machiavelli was not anti-religious. He was, more precisely, anti-naive. In the Discourses, he observed that religion, properly wielded, is among the most potent instruments of political control ever devised. It sanctifies authority, suppresses dissent, and asks the governed to direct their grievances not at earthly rulers, but at divine providence. For the prince who controls the religious apparatus, it is a gift of incalculable value. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, represents perhaps the most complete contemporary example of this principle in action. Since assuming the role in 1989, Khamenei has presided over a theocratic architecture in which religious authority and political power are deliberately fused. The office of the supreme leader holds ultimate authority over the military, judiciary, and state broadcaster, while deriving its legitimacy not from the electorate, but from divine appointment, at least in the official account. The result is a system that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately. Dissent against the government becomes, by definition, dissent against God. The Green Movement protests of 2009, the nationwide uprisings of 2019, and the Woman, Life, Freedom movement of 2022 were all met with the same response: violent suppression, framed in the language of protecting the sacred order. In Machiavellian terms, the supreme leader has effectively privatized the concept of legitimacy, making it extraordinarily costly to oppose him. The weapon is not merely the state, it is God himself. A prince who wishes to maintain his rule must know how to practice both the beast and the man. Niccolò Machiavelli, The Prince. 4. Meritocracy, the most successful myth of the modern age. The doctrine of meritocracy, the belief that advancement follows ability and effort, is perhaps the defining ideology of the modern era. It is also, in large measure, a myth. Not a complete myth. Talent and hard work do sometimes produce reward. But as a systematic description of how power and wealth are distributed, meritocracy is regularly and comprehensively defeated by something older and more reliable, the network. Machiavelli understood this long before the word existed. He wrote extensively about the importance of surrounding oneself with the right advisors, cultivating the loyalty of key allies, and ensuring that those who might threaten one's position were either co-opted or neutralized. The modern corporate equivalent is the relationship capital that determines who gets the contract, who gets the board seat, and whose call gets returned. The Murdoch dynasty offers an instructive example. Rupert Murdoch built a global media empire of extraordinary reach, a genuine exercise of talent and will. But the succession of that empire to his son Lachlan, and the maneuvering of family members through the company's highest levels, follows a pattern entirely familiar to any student of Renaissance courts. Talent may open the door, dynasty holds it open. Similarly, the Koch brothers, Charles and David, spent decades constructing not merely a corporate empire, but a political one, funding think tanks, political candidates, and ideological movements that systematically advanced their economic interests. This is Machiavelli's virtue in its most modern form, the capacity to shape the environment in which one operates, rather than merely responding to it. In the Koch model, the political system itself became an instrument of commercial advantage. The Epstein network, Machiavellian architecture and practice. Jeffrey Epstein built his operation on a single profound insight. Access is the most valuable and most underpriced commodity in modern society. He understood, perhaps better than anyone of his generation, that the powerful will do almost anything to remain proximate to power. By aggregating an extraordinary network of scientists, politicians, royals, financiers, and academics, he created something that functioned less like a social circle and more like a clearinghouse for influence. Epstein's genius, if one may use the word without conferring moral approval, was structural. He collected people who could be useful to other people, and then made himself the indispensable intermediary. In Machiavellian terms, he had no principality and no hereditary claim. But he constructed a form of power that was, for a time, remarkably durable. He was, in essence, a prince without a crown, governing through obligation rather than title. His relationship with Andrew was in this sense perfectly logical. Andrew possessed something Epstein needed: the currency of royal legitimacy, the cultural authority of a British prince, the doors that opened when he knocked. In exchange, Epstein offered Andrew what Andrew seemed to need: access to wealth, to a certain kind of social world, and, fatally, to a milieu in which normal rules appeared not to apply. It was a transaction, and both parties understood it as such. That it was also deeply criminal is a separate, if not unrelated, matter. What Epstein constructed was, in effect, a legalized version of what lobbyists perform in Washington on a daily basis. The lobby industry, a $4 billion annual enterprise in the United States, exists for one purpose: to translate private wealth into public policy. Former senators and congressmen sell their contact lists and reputations to corporations who wish to influence legislation. It is Epstein's model, stripped of the criminality and clothed in bureaucratic language. Machiavelli would have found it entirely unremarkable. 6. The corporate court, dynasties in the boardroom. If monarchies represent political power dressed in historical legitimacy, the modern corporation represents its economic equivalent. And like political dynasties, corporate dynasties reproduce themselves with remarkable fidelity across generations. Samsung's Lee family has governed the South Korean conglomerate, one of the world's largest, across 3 generations, despite criminal convictions, pardons, and boardroom scandals that would have ended most careers. Lee Jae-yong, the current de facto leader, received a presidential pardon in 2022 after conviction for bribery related to the political corruption scandal that brought down President Park Geun-hye. He returned to his position without material consequence. This is Machiavellian realpolitik applied to corporate governance. The rules that apply to ordinary participants do not apply to princes. The story of Silvio Berlusconi, media mogul, 3-time Italian prime minister, convicted criminal and persistent political force until his death in 2023. represents one of the most complete fusions of corporate and political power in modern European history. Berlusconi did not merely participate in Italian politics. He restructured it around his personal commercial interests, using control of television networks to manufacture consent and legislative power to shield himself from prosecution. Machiavelli, who wrote for an Italian audience intimately familiar with the fusion of private interest and public power, would have recognized the model instantly. Vladimir Putin represents perhaps the most systematic modern exercise in the construction of durable personal power. Over 2.5 decades, he has methodically dismantled independent institutions, co-opted the business elite through the implicit threat of prosecution, and used the apparatus of the state to eliminate political rivals. His technique is essentially Machiavellian. Reward loyalty extravagantly, punish disloyalty absolutely, and maintain enough uncertainty about consequences that potential opponents never feel safe enough to organize. The oligarchs who supported him became extraordinarily wealthy. Those who challenged him, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, imprisoned, Boris Berezovsky, dead in exile, served as clear demonstrations of the price of defiance. 7. Conclusion. The system is working as intended. The public's recurring shock at the behavior of the powerful, at Andrew, at Berlusconi, at the accumulated evidence of how influence actually circulates, reflects a kind of willed innocence. We are surprised because we believe, or wish to believe, in the meritocratic myth, that the system is fundamentally fair, that power is granted on the basis of merit, and that its abuse is an aberration rather than a feature. Machiavelli would counsel us to abandon this comfort. The prince who survives, he argued, is the one who sees the world as it is rather than as it ought to be. This counsel applies equally to those who observe power from the outside. Andrew was not corrupted by power. He was shaped by a system that made the trading of royal access entirely logical, even rational, given his circumstances. The systems that enabled Epstein, that sustained Khamenei, that protected Lee Jae-yong and elevated Berlusconi and consolidated Putin, these are not failures of the system. They are the system operating at peak efficiency, optimizing for exactly what systems of power have always optimized for, the perpetuation of the powerful. The question Machiavelli asked, and which remains unanswered, is not whether this is morally acceptable. He was largely uninterested in that question, but whether it is stable. History suggests the answer is, temporarily. Every prince eventually encounters a force he cannot neutralize or co-opt. Whether that force arrives as a revolution, a prosecutor, a scandal, or simply the indifferent passage of time, the architecture of personal power has never yet proven permanent. What changes between the 16th century and the present is not the structure of power, but the vocabulary we use to describe it. We call it lobbying instead of tribute, networking instead of fealty, access instead of patronage. The currency is different. The exchange rate is not.